Well, good morning once again, everybody, and I want to give a welcome as well to any of you who might be joining us through our website or our Facebook page or perhaps on our YouTube channel for our lesson today. When I see a large tree with its branches spread out and filled with beautiful leaves, I may think this is a picture of wholeness. Yet as I choose to see the bigger picture, I realize I'm not seeing the whole tree. Its roots dig deeply into the ground for nutrition, to build the tree that I can see before me. Similarly, when I look at my body, I may at first think I'm seeing the totality of me. In truth, though, I know that there is much more to me than my physical form. My wholeness comprises the totality of my physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual natures. I bless and appreciate each aspect of my being, knowing that they all work together. My roots are deep in this spiritual awareness. I remember the truth of my spiritual identity, and I celebrate my wholeness. That was the reading offered in Unity's Daily Word magazine last month on June 10th. And I offer it today as the opening to our third installment of our Prosperity series for this year. Our series, which we offer in 5 installments spread out over the course of the year, is titled Dare to Prosper, which aligns with our overall theme for the ministry for 2020, which is Dare to Make a Difference. And you'll recall that we're using that word dare in acronym form to have it stand for dream it, affirm it, realize it, and express it. We began this series back in January. It was a part of our Spiritual Master series that kicked us off for this year. And we looked at the teachings of prosperity as offered by Unity Minister Eric Butterworth, also a spiritual or a prosperity master in his own right. And specifically, we looked at his thoughts of how we can live a life of prosperity, live abundantly every single day. And then in May, our second installment took us deeper into Unity's first basic spiritual teaching, that there is one presence and one power in our lives, inviting us to explore ways in which we were living that principle by just asking ourselves every single day, what would my life be like if I approached everything as if God is all there is? As we continue our series today, the underlying statement for us is going to be the affirmation that was contained in that daily word reading, the closing that said, I remember the truth of my spiritual identity and I celebrate my wholeness. Last fall, when I was beginning to outline different topics for lessons for this particular year, I had a certain idea come to mind as to where this particular lesson might go. And I jotted down a note or two and just filed it away. But then a few months ago, I received my copy of Unity magazine. And I read an article that was in it written by a Unity minister. Her name is Joy Weiler. And it presented an entirely different, a very new perspective on wholeness. And it was one that challenged the more typical ideas offered when we think about what wholeness or what healing looks like. And in their place, Joy offered for our consideration what she refers to as radical wholeness. So let me share a little bit about Joy's backstory, one that certainly qualifies her to write and present this new idea of wholeness. Joy was born in the 1950s in a small town in Missouri, and she was born with a rare form of dwarfism. She shares that when she was born, the doctors told her parents that she was, quote unquote, too deformed to survive. Too deformed to survive. And they also discouraged her parents from even picking up and holding their newborn baby girl so that they wouldn't become too attached to her. For the first 3 days of her life, she was isolated in a far back corner of the nursery at the hospital where she was born. But on that third day, her father went to the hospital, and she writes, my daddy demanded to take his perfect baby girl home, to love her as long as he had her. I survived quite nicely. Now, unfortunately, thoughts and attitudes didn't change much over the next 30 years, because 30 years later, Joy was now the one giving birth, and doing so this time in a much larger city, a metropolitan area, a modern medical center. And the doctors began to issue warnings to everyone in her family to prepare themselves to see a very deformed baby. But when Joy's mother saw her new granddaughter for the very first time, her words were, "She's perfect. She looks just like her mom." Joy offers that deformity, like beauty, is indeed in the eye of the beholder. So Joy was blessed by the way that she was seen as whole by her parents, just as she saw her new daughter. But eventually, a radical kind of shift occurred for Joy. She's reading a book by Eric Butterworth. It's titled Practical Metaphysics, and this is a book that came out after Eric had already passed on. It's a compilation of various lectures, classwork, writings of his that Unity Books gathered together, put in book form, and published just back in 2017. And in the book, there was a section where Butterworth was speaking to this idea of spiritual wholeness. And he also used the word allness interchangeably, allness with a capital A. And he noted how you and I might not always see ourselves in relationship to this wholeness, to this allness of spirit in us. And yet that relationship exists, always exists, whether we know it or not. And he went on to say that we would experience the degree to which we know it. And therefore, if we see ourselves in part, then we're going to have a partial experience of this overall wholeness, this spiritual allness. And then he wrote, even in the midst of that partial experience, a partial experience which may be in terms of not enough money, or not a good job, or poor relationships, or physical difficulties or deformity, in every case, this is a partial expression of the wholeness, a partial expression of the allness of God. So what Joy was seeing in front of her was a declaration that our physical challenges or difficulties, along with what many others might judge as being deformities, in every case, they were only partial expressions of our true, divine, and whole selves. And she immediately challenged that idea. And part of the challenge arose from her wondering how in the world New Thought teachers and writers and ministers like Butterworth could embrace an ever-evolving picture of diversity in our human family, and yet continue to cling to just one image, that of an able-bodied human being, as the sole image of what manifesting total wholeness looks like. So she felt that we needed to maybe shift our emphasis a little bit and start placing greater emphasis on how each of us, how each individual sees ourselves. To let go of those old ways wherein someone else would try to tell you or me or other people that our expressions of our spiritual wholeness, the allness of God, were limited in some way, could only be partial in some ways. To no longer allow someone else's judgments or biases or perspectives of outside physical appearance or life experiences tell us that we were less than whole. So what Joy proposes is quite simple. She proposes that spiritual wholeness can be fully expressed in physical bodies deemed less than able by others. And that is what she has chosen to call radical wholeness. So before we look at her proposal a bit more, I want to just pause for a moment because we have Joy's story. one which is obviously focused on spiritual wholeness, shared from a perspective of her physical appearance, the challenges that she's encountered as a result of her dwarfism, including how others have chosen to judge her, how others have chosen to see her because of that. But there are so many additional experiences in life that can have a potentially negative impact on how we see ourselves or how others see us, how we judge our own wholeness in relationship to spirit. I mean, Butterworth mentioned a few, not enough money, not having a good job, having poor relationships. I mean, in my own mind, I can hear each of those 3 boxes getting checked off. I've experienced all of those, and I can remember how I often felt less than. I can remember how very disconnected I felt from spirit as each of those times in my life were unfolding. So I just wanted to give you a moment to let Joy's story be hers, and to allow to come to your mind anything from your own stories, anything that might be obscuring your view of your own complete wholeness. Maybe try to tell you that you're unable to fully express the allness of God's presence in you. And whatever may be coming to mind, I invite you to just try to let it come to mind. Let it be present right there with you, and also be present to a few ideas about radical wholeness. Because I think that while they're being offered to us, primarily from the perspective of how we have often related the lack of wholeness to physical appearances or perceived inabilities and such, the ideas being presented can apply to any number of perspectives and judgments of other life experiences as well that can sometimes try to work to limit our view of ourselves. So the first thing that we want to consider is the idea of resistance. And it sort of makes sense that if we're talking about making a radical change as to how we have been thinking or seeing or acting, it's probably safe to say that we have been seeing, thinking, and acting a certain way for a long time. And there might be some resistance to something new. But as we've talked about before, anytime we resist something, we're losing out on the opportunities to learn something new, to see, new possibilities, to open up to especially unfamiliar possibilities. And these are the very things that Joy, noted in her writing, is that's what reveals the new vistas to us, right? That's what expands our view. It reveals new and broadened perspectives and possibilities. And I really like the way she suggested we can begin to, both gauge any resistance we might have, as well as begin to open to seeing more than we do at the moment, relative to our beliefs around wholeness. And she suggested that we just start asking, what if? What if? As soon as those 2 words, come into my mind, for me, I feel pretty certain that anything that's going to come after those 2 words is going to be something new. It's going to be something that I don't know. It's going to be something I hadn't thought of before, I hadn't considered before, something I hadn't seen before, something I hadn't tried before. For example, Joy referenced how New Thought leaders and practitioners like all of us have been really good. We've been so good in broadening our vista, broadening our perspectives around the diversity that exists within our human family, and the fact that that is something that is continually evolving, and we've been pretty good about continuing to evolve along with it. We can probably, all, maybe not all, but most of us think of a time or attest to the fact where our spiritual teachings and such have helped us to move past maybe some old ideas that we once had, or perhaps past some theologies that do see spiritual wholeness in relation to things like race and sexual orientation and gender identification and physical appearance and abilities and so forth. And it's wonderful to have moved beyond that way of thinking. But Joy asks, what if? What if we went further? What if we just stopped altogether the labeling of people that we do sometimes according to their physicality, or according to their appearances, or according to what we assume to be inabilities, or what we assume to know about someone's life or their experiences? What if we moved past any belief that might still be in us that tells us that for whatever may be going on, in our opinion, in someone else's life, we already know. We already know for sure the exact kind of healing experience that they might need or that their hearts may be desiring so that they can no longer be less than whole. So you got to move past that because, first of all, the other person might not see whatever we're seeing as a challenge. They might not be seeing it that way. And second of all, it's just pretty arrogant, really. It's pretty arrogant for anybody to claim unerring knowledge about any kind of healing experience at that spiritual level that someone else needs. I can remember for years, after my divorce, there was this small circle of people that if I ever shared that maybe there had been a bump in the road for me or they thought there was something wrong in my life, I'd have to listen to them just tell me all I needed was a man. I just needed a man. A man in my life again would solve all my problems. It would make my life, it would make me whole again. Now, today I can kind of roll my eyes and smile at that, but I got to tell you, in all honesty, when I was hearing it from them, they were not injecting humor. They were dead serious. And they were judging me as being partially whole because of a broken relationship. The very same way that the doctors and others had told their Judge Joy and her daughter as being less than because of their physical appearance. So I think maybe the best what if that we can utter in order to stop, looking at appearances, stop making judgments, whether we're doing it about ourselves or whether we're doing it towards other people, is to just look within and ask ourselves, what if I just start shifting my own consciousness? I just start shifting my own consciousness into higher levels of awareness of what wholeness really is. See, it's always in our consciousness that the true shifts occur. It is always in our consciousness first that true and perfect healing occurs for us. It is in our consciousness where true wholeness is revealed to us. And you and I, and each individual, is the only one that can do that for themselves. No one else can know that about us. No one else can experience that for us. We can only know it for ourselves, and other people can only know it for themselves. And our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, he was right on with this understanding of the totality of our wholeness, like our daily word opening, shared. Because as he did his studies and he did his personal practices, he came to describe wholeness as the perfect unification and expression of the human being as spirit, soul, and body. He said true healing means to make whole. And so what if we were able to have this unification and this expression and see ourselves in this way much more than we might be doing so today? How might that enlarge our individual worlds and our overall world as well? How might that enlarge our lives? How might that multiply the beauty and the blessings that we may not be seeing today? There's a wonderful story in Scripture that depicts this radical idea of seeing something in new ways. It's in the 9th chapter of John's Gospel, and it tells a story of a man who was born blind. And the disciples start asking Jesus, whose fault was that? They ask him, is the man somehow at fault himself for coming into this world without sight? Is it his parents' fault? Jesus tells them it was nobody's fault. And the verse that describes his response says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. So right there, we're told that this man is no different. This man is no less than someone else who was born with no afflictions. It tells us that each of us comes into this world, born into this world as a sacred being, each of us being carriers of that divine, and each of us here to allow that divine presence in us to reveal itself to us and then be expressed through us. The story tells us right there that each of us is 100% whole from day one. Now, if you're familiar with the story, it goes on to tell how Jesus waters down some clay and he packs it over the man's eyes, and the man rinses it off and his sight is restored. It tells us how for years he had just been a beggar. He had had a very poor outlook on life, but now his sight has returned, and it's given him a whole new way of being. It's brought him confidence. It has brought him poise. It has transformed his life. Joy Weiler asks us to see that a bit more radically and not only traditionally. She asks, what if? She wrote, what if the only sight restored in this man is his ability to see himself as the expression of divine wisdom, power, and love that he was created to be? That's so much more powerful a healing than restoring mere physical sight. The man then becomes aware of his wholeness, and with that healing, his life changes. And Mr. Fillmore actually wrote about this more radical perspective in his book, Mysteries of John. As he wrote about the healing process in the story, he points out how important it is to note that it was the man who washed the clay from his eyes. How important it is to note that the man taking action on his own behalf illustrates how we, of our own volition, can stop giving away our inherent divine power to outer conditions or to other people in our lives. That instead, by tapping into our consciousness, that's where we tap into our true wholeness. That's where we tap into our true identity. That's how we begin to transform ourselves. And when we can see ourselves in new and sacred ways, it automatically will begin to show up, just like it did in that man, in our attitudes, in our actions, our perceptions, our choices, everything. Because we're no longer held back by old views of ourselves, or no longer held back by others' assumptions or judgments of our value. We allow God to reveal itself in us and then through us in ways that are only ours to do. We start to dare to make a difference in this life. We start to dare to prosper and live an abundant life. And that life does indeed become much larger and much more fulfilling as a result. Radical wholeness is my birthright. It's everyone's birthright. Those are the words that close Joy's article. And they followed one final proposal from her. You see, she too firmly believes that life becomes abundantly full when we live from a conscious awareness of our spiritual wholeness, that it has the power to radiate out into our finances, our health, our careers, our relationships, every aspect, nook and cranny of our life. And she also believes that it does apply to all people. And so here's her proposal for us today. She writes, I propose that we recast our language and examples to be more inclusive and empowering so the healing experience speaks to everyone. To perceive ourselves as powerful creations of the divine. To discern the spiritual truth and apply it in our lives. To take those confident actions that shine our spiritual light in the world. And to accept that spiritual wholeness may express through each of us in ways we cannot measure or discern from outside. So if I wanted to drill that down a little bit more, I might say, why don't we all just try to see ourselves and see others like Joy's daddy saw her. Absolutely perfect and completely whole from day one, as every creation of a loving God always is. God bless you.